That is all of the housekeeping items I have. So I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators today. We're really happy to have Kristin and Daniel from the Center for Extended Learning here today to facilitate this TA facilitation in a remote teaching environment workshop. So I'll turn it over to them now.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me? Can I just get a head nod? Still working? Good, great. Okay, welcome. So just to kick us off, I'll, oops, slides are not advancing. There we go. We'll just go over, go through an overview of where we're going to go today. So for part one, we're going to just cover just briefly the online and remote learning context and talk a little bit about students' needs in this context. You may have some questions about that and how to serve them. And then Daniel's going to talk about the very important role that TAs play as online facilitators. And then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the how-to. How do you do this? In this section, we're going to talk about email announcements, discussion boards, hosting online office hours and labs and tutorials. And we're going to be covering a lot. We're just going to touch a bit on each of these things. We'll have some time at the end to answer your questions. So just make sure that as we're going along, you have questions, you're posting them in the Q&A, and you're upvoting any question that you also share. Okay. Great. So by the end of this session, we hope that you'll be able to identify your important role, the important role that you play in online and remote courses, that you'll be able to take into account and understand the student experience and take that into account in your approach to your role as a TA. We hope that by the end, you'll be able to start thinking through some of the strategies that you'll want to use that feel authentic to you, that help you connect with your students, help you to teach and support the students in your course. And we hope that by the end, you have a greater sense of confidence, a greater comfort level, and maybe even enthusiasm for as we venture into this, this next term, this new learning context. Okay, so just a bit about what this context is. So some of you will be enrolled in teaching sections that are 081, and some of you have taught online before, and they likely were a 081 course, and these 081 section courses are a little bit different than the remote courses that are taking place in conjunction with these 081 courses this term. These courses were designed over many months. They essentially are already complete. Often, many of these courses have been taught before, and they're fully developed, designed for online format mode. And your tasks and duties are likely already established. And another thing to sort of keep in mind with these online courses is it's often the case that the instructor you'll be working with may not have been the author of the course, so they didn't necessarily design the assessments, and they didn't pull together all the content. And what that kind of really means for you is that in the first week or two, the instructor themselves may be coming oriented to the course. They might not know everything that is in there, so they're still trying to figure that out and navigate it themselves. Courses that are section 001 or 002 were initially intended to be in-person courses, and these instructors over the past several weeks have been engaged in this huge feat of quickly pivoting what they do in person into an online format. And so what that means is when you come into these courses, they may not be done. The instructors may just be a week or two ahead of students. So opposed to the 081 courses, you might not be able to go in and see all of the content that's in there and know exactly what's coming. Your tasks and duties might not be fully established, or there might be more discussion with the course instructor about what that'll look like. It might evolve a little over the term. The syllabus and the assessment should be figured out, but some of the details might not yet be. But the instructor is the course author, so they really will be able to answer any of your questions about the course content and where it's going if the content is not already in there available for you to see. So if you haven't taken an online course or TA'd in an online course at University of Waterloo before, you might have some questions about, well, how does this happen? How does this work? We're used to interacting with students in a group, in tutorials, in live lectures. How do we do that online? Is it just all videos of instructors talking? And the answer is no. There's a lot of different ways to present content, and there's just a huge variety of what's out there. And what we do, what you primarily will see though is a combination of presentations and videos. So these might be narrated PowerPoints, demonstration videos. Typically they're broken into smaller chunks, so you won't necessarily, there won't necessarily be, you know, an hour or two long. A lot of courses will have more text, have text in them. In addition to assigned readings, there might be HTML pages or pages in Learn where a lot of the content is written out, and there might be a conjunction of text and visuals together to help get those ideas across. There may be a lot of links to external resources. The instructors have curated other resources that are out there, and that's something that you might also be able to do and bring into your own office hours and tutorials and labs that you might be doing. But really, there tends to be a mixture of all of these different formats. You may have some questions about what kind of activities and assignments students will be doing, or you'll be in charge of facilitating and grading. Most online courses and remote courses, a lot of them are going to have discussions, not just as a place for students to ask their questions and get help and support, but a lot of these discussions may be graded as a formative assessment. Weekly quizzes are very common. These help students to keep up. They tend to be lower stakes, providing student feedback on their learning. And you'll also see a lot of familiar assessments in terms of problem sets and writing assignments that would be submitted to Dropbox or done through CrowdMark, which is commonly used in math. Group assignments are frequent, and what we're going to see probably a little more this term than previous terms is online tutorials and labs, as more and diverse courses are being pivoted online. Okay, so it may be helpful just to have, just to go over some of the things that students really like and appreciate and will probably enjoy about this pivot online, what the research tells us about what students like, and some of the things that students are challenged by. In particular, in that challenge column, these are things that your role as an online facilitator, as an online TA, there's a lot you can do to really help students with the challenge column. So online provides a lot of flexibility for students. They really can learn anytime, anywhere. So they really do like that aspect of it, or there's components of that flexibility that they like. If they are not a morning person, they don't have to worry about morning lectures anymore. They can learn at night. They can learn at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's really very flexible in that sense. Students are self-paced in their online courses to a large extent. So they can move through the course at their own rate. Of course, there are deadlines, there are assessments that we use to keep students moving forward. But they can really go back and return to content. They can start and stop it as they please. So it provides a lot of control for students. So they like that, and they tend to like that there are multiple modes for them to learn. A combination of videos, visuals, text, readings, different modalities. They enjoy that, as well as interactions. What they're challenged by, sort of the dark side of flexibility, is that if they can learn anytime, there is not as much external pressure to do it right now. So it requires a little more motivation, self-motivation, self-direction from students. There may be more distractions at home compared to the lecture hall. So these are things that students are, some challenges they're working with. If it's self-paced, they might pace themselves too slowly and they start to fall behind. So these are some things to just kind of keep in mind, thinking about strategies that you might use to support your students, keep them moving forward. Another issue online is accessibility. In particular, videos can be a bit of a problem. So alternatives, you want to think about that if you are in the asked to create any kind of video for a course. There may be some students that cannot hear or see what you're presenting. So you want to think about an alternative for that. And of course, if you're going to be using any technologies, you want to think about students that are seeing or hearing impaired, as well as have some technology or digital limitations in terms of where they are in the world. So just some things to keep in mind. Some additional challenges that are really unique to this context. We're living in a time of COVID. And a lot of us are working with these challenges, but just as a reminder that for a lot of these students, they may not be fully prepared for online in terms of meeting technology requirements. They are maybe living in rural or remote areas within Canada or anywhere in the world where their internet is spotty at best. Some of our students we know are relying completely on their mobile device. They don't have a computer at all. So these are some of the challenges that students and us as facilitators are going to be working with. Another thing to keep in mind is that home for some students is not a quiet or a safe space. They may be taking care of children, their children, siblings, young siblings, and there may be even domestic abuse at home that they can no longer get away from. They may be sick. They may fall sick over the course of the term. A loved one may fall sick. So these are things that we're going to see a little more of this term, and as well. Isolation, loneliness, and uncertainties, it sort of marks this time for a lot of people. And we know that those are predictors of depression and anxiety, so we might see a little bit of an increase in sort of mental health symptoms. And so you may be thinking about these and be concerned about that. And there are some things that we can do as facilitators to help mitigate some of these challenges. And what is really called for at this time is understanding that this cohort of students is under a different kind of pressure, and there are different challenges that might require a little more flexibility and compassion than we would normally need to extend. And that might look like providing more alternatives to synchronous sessions, not requiring students to turn on their video and expose a part of their life that they're really not comfortable doing. One nice thing about going completely remote here is that resources that were previously only available on campus are now remotely and virtually available. So Campus Wellness is offering virtual sessions, call-in sessions, and virtual counseling. And the Writing Center is completely virtual. They have lots of things that they're offering. Supports for students there are available now to all students. And really, there are many ways for you to monitor, to connect with, to communicate with your students. So there are many ways that you can support students through these challenges. And so Daniel is going to talk a bit more about your role. I'm just going to switch over here.
Can you hear me all right? Let me pull up my slide now. Sorry, we have to switch over the screen share. We could not get the quick and easy way to do that functioning, so here we go. All right, so I'm Daniel Opperwall. Just a little bit of background from me. Can you hear me okay, Kristin? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, you can. Great. Just a little background about me. I've been here at University of Waterloo for a bit under a year now, and I've been teaching online since 2015, so a full 5 years. And before that, during my PhD, I was a TA for 4 years. I was a little bit before many people were online at that point in time, but I do have a lot of very fond memories of the TA lifestyle, so I know what it's like. And so we've heard a little bit about what online and remote, especially courses, are looking like right now, and you've heard a little bit about what your students are going through and some of their needs. So it's time to talk about your role. The big question, what am I supposed to do in here? So I wanted to start with just some nuts and bolts. and then take a step forward to think a little more broadly, kind of theoretically, if you will, about how online or remote TAing really works. In terms of the nuts and bolts, what I really want you to take away from this is not having an absolute sense of how everything's going to work. All of your courses are very different. All of your instructors are very different, and the needs are very different. What I really am trying to give you here is a sense of the questions you need to ask. Make sure you have a clear answer to, a clear picture of from your instructor, especially, as well as the rest of the TAs in your group if you're working in a team. So here's some of the really key questions, key things to address with your instructor and your team. What exactly are the assignments and activities involved in your remote course? Make sure you know exactly what the plan is for all of those. If your instructor is building a little bit on the fly, there may be some changes as term goes on. But what you want to have a picture of, if you possibly can at the start, is exactly what are the assignments and exactly what are the activities. And then exactly what is your role in facilitating those assignments and activities. Make sure you sat down and talked with your instructor about that and their expectations for you. So, will you be conducting, for example, tutorials? If so, is there a plan for how to do that? If there's not a plan, you want to make a plan. Will you be conducting office hours? Kristin's going to talk a little bit more about both tutorials and office hours in our next section after I'm done. Make sure you've got a sense of that. Are you expected to conduct these? How and when? Will there be discussion forums or other activities? This was alluded to a little earlier. But you want to know whether you're going to have to be monitoring asynchronous discussions and exactly what the expectations for you in your involvement in that are going to be. Make sure that's on your list. And finally, I'm about to present you a long list here, but there's really kind of just one key question. Which tools, which digital tools will you be using in this course? They're not all the same by any stretch. So for example, all of your courses, it's safe to assume, will be using Learn in some way, shape, or form. So that's on the list for sure. But there's a bunch of other variables, other things that you want to make sure you're aware of going in. Will you be using Dropboxes? Very probably you will. Most courses tend to use Dropboxes at University of Waterloo. This is a place where students submit assignments. Make sure you know that there's going to be Dropboxes in the course. And if you need some training, you need some support to learn to use those, make sure you get that. And we'll share some resources for that kind of training a bit later or after. Is your course going to be using discussion boards? I already brought this up, but again, make sure you know the tool if it's going to be used. Is your course going to be using quizzes? And if so, once again, make sure you've got a sense of that. These three tools, Dropboxes, discussion boards, and quizzes, are in a very solid majority of courses. Very, very likely that your course is going to be using these three tools. But make sure. Now I'm going to give you a few tools that are less often used. And so if you see these, or if your instructor indicates that you're planning to use them, make sure you've got a sense of what's going on and how to deal with them. Piazza is a discussion tool that we often see for STEM courses. So if you are in STEM, and I saw from the poll that quite a few of you are, double check whether you'll be using Piazza, how you'll need to be involved in it, and make sure you know how to use the tool. PebblePad is an e-portfolio tool that we see sometimes in humanities courses, also in STEM actually as well. PebblePad is a tool that takes a little bit of work to master, especially on the back end. So if you see that in your course, make sure you get on that and have a picture of what to do. CrowdMark is a grading tool. So ask about that, or if you see that in your course. Bongo virtual classrooms and video assignments. This is something we're seeing a lot in remote courses, especially those that are using some synchronous strategies. Again, we'll talk a little bit about those in the next section. If that's there, double check with your instructor whether you'll be using those live or whether you'll be using asynchronous features of Bongo. WebEx is another conferencing tool that's being used for synchronous. A little bit less, I think, than Bongo is being used right now on campus, but it might be there in your course. And there might be lots of other tools. The ones that I've just listed are the kind of University of Waterloo tools. They're sort of almost in-house tools, but there's all kinds of web-based third-party things that are out there that your instructor might be using or wanting to use. Make sure you've got a sense of what those are and how to deal with them. So that's your nuts and bolts, just getting your questions answered. It's very stripped down, very simple, maybe almost obvious. So forgive me if it seems obvious to you, but make sure you've got a sense of the answers to those key questions about what are the assignments, what are the tools, and what do you need to do with them. So now let's talk a little bit more about actually making a difference, helping your students to learn at a sort of more theoretical level, not just the structural stuff. So as a TA, you're really used to being the front line of your face-to-face courses. You serve as the face of a lot of your courses to your students. You're offering tutorials, you're marking exams and assignments, you're fielding questions, and you are serving as that essential touch point, that key resource for all your students. In essence, when you boil it all down, you are the linchpin in creating a human teaching presence for your students. So things like lectures, readings, and that kind of stuff is bringing all the information in, all this excellent quality content, hopefully, to your students that they need to succeed. You are the important factor in bringing a social presence, a connection with another human being, a group of other human beings that people also really need to succeed and to learn, generally speaking, not just online. So the number one thing, the number one takeaway I'd give you about serving in an online course is that this is still your role, and it's just the medium, the mode of connection that has changed around you. It's not the actual heart of what you're trying to do as a TA. These days, there's lots of options for people to do self-directed learning online. I mean, you may have run into MOOCs, massive open online courses, or open educational resources that are out there. You could just sit and watch YouTube and read books, of course. People can go out and learn almost anything they want to learn these days online, and often for free. And that can work for a small number of students. But there's a really important reason that people come to a place like University of Waterloo and take these remote or online courses together with somebody like you. And the reason is that those self-directed methods of learning, although the content might be really excellent, they lack a key element of learning, which is community. The key element of community is what we're trying to build in a remote course or a properly online course that's different from a MOOC or something self-directed. And that's the heart of your work and your job as a TA, to try to build community in spite of the distance we have between each other through all these different computer screens. If we don't take any action at all, students who are learning remotely will feel isolated. They'll start to feel neglected, they'll feel disconnected. A lot of them will drop out. And even those that stick around will have much less success in their course overall. So we can start to combat that, to push back against that, to help students feel that connection in that community in a number of ways. So I want to identify a few strategies for you here. To help you feel connected, students should know who you are and should have a sense of your personality and your interest in the course. Finding ways to communicate that to them, who you are and why you care about this subject, is really key to working in the online environment. To feel connected, students should know where to get help, and they should feel comfortable doing so. And that's both on the technical front and all of the normal problems that students will have in learning any subject. They need to know where to look and where to turn, and they need to feel comfortable. Students should feel confident that they can get their questions answered promptly and effectively, often by you or by whoever else it is that needs to be answering their questions. Students should feel that you care about their success in the course, that it matters to you. Students should feel that you care about them as people. And that's, I think, especially true considering the challenges so many of us are facing right now. Showing some compassion for what your students are, making sure they feel that sense that you care and you understand, of course, that they're dealing with COVID just like all the rest of us. Makes an enormous difference to their learning of content. And all told, what that all means put together is they should experience your presence in the course consistently. They should feel like you're there, present in this space, even though now it's a digital space instead of a classroom. If they feel like you were there, research is unequivocal. They will learn and they will succeed much better than if they feel disconnected. So how do you do this? How do you signal your presence in a course? Well, we're going to talk about a bunch of different tasks and tools that are essential to the online learning environment in the next section. But I want to highlight 4 here right now. We'll unpack these a little bit, open these up soon. 4 right now that are really important to keep in mind for signaling your presence. The first there is announcements, your email, marking, believe it or not, and discussion forums. Those are the 4 I want to start talking about, and then I will hand it back over to Kristin for a few other issues to discuss. So shifting here into part 3 about more the nitty-gritty and the practical. So I want to start with announcements as a way of creating a sense of presence in your course. Announcements might not be the first thing you think of when it comes to creating a sense of community, but in my own opinion, honestly, they're the number one thing, the number one tool that I turn to over and over again for creating a feeling of presence. My recommendation is to make announcements at least once a week in your course, if not more often. And make sure that what you say is clearly connected to what's going on in the course and in fact in the world, in the community, in the news, whatever that means for you right now. If it's really clear that you wrote this announcement today about this course, it really shows students that you're here, that you're engaging with course contents consistently. So announcements can take a lot of forms and have a lot of different content. They might include reminders about due dates, how to get support. They might bolster student engagement with content-related issues, clarify concepts, provide summary feedback on assessments. But most of all, they give that sense of presence and personality. So even if you're making an announcement about a due date or something that's coming up, bring yourself into it. Share maybe a little joke. Share something from the news that caught your eye that's relevant. Share the fact that you care and you empathize with what's going on with your students in COVID. Most weeks you're going to have something to mention in an announcement anyway. But if you find yourself with nothing practical that you need to make an announcement about, find a reason anyway, in my opinion, to make that general connection with all your students through an announcement. Next thing to talk about is email support. Now, we usually use email, unsurprisingly, for one-on-one communication with students. Of course, if you want to talk to the whole class, you're going to go over and make an announcement in general. So in that one-on-one communication, the number one rule of thumb is to respond promptly. I can't emphasize enough how essential it is to try to respond within 24 hours is our usual rule of thumb for online teaching. You obviously cannot be monitoring your email all day, every day, and responding within a few minutes, and no one expects that. Your students don't expect that. But if you can do it within 24 hours, that really signals to your students, yes, I'm here, I care, I'm present, and your success matters to me. It makes an enormous difference, just the promptness of your response. You'll often use these for direct course-related questions. You might do some Q&A with your students. Always be mindful of your tone in email. This isn't radically different in teaching online, of course, versus just living your life in the rest of the world, but being especially mindful to keep signaling that presence and that care for your students. What is a little bit different here is they won't have the backdrop of knowing you face-to-face if they've only met you remotely. So it does take a little bit of extra care to make sure that the text you're putting into emails and that sort of thing is communicating exactly what you want it to, because they don't have that way of offsetting from knowing your personality. The next thing I want to bring up is marking, which is maybe not, again, an area that jumps to mind when you think about creating presence in a course. But this is, of course, one of the most essential points of contact that you have with all of your students. You're marking their work, and it's the heart of a lot of what TAs do. So use this as an opportunity to really communicate and connect with your students. Number one, again, be prompt. Very similar as with the emails. When students see that you're marking things promptly, and that means different things in different courses, so I won't give you a number there, but when they see you're marking things promptly, again, it communicates presence and it communicates care. Signal your presence through what you say. Use the opportunity for comments to get some of that personality across once again. Let yourself show through, let your presence show through. And once again, remember that text-based comments can come off a bit differently from verbal comments. Now, if you've been grading papers or exams in face-to-face, you're doing text-based commenting there as well. So again, this isn't radically different, except for, once more, the lack of that sort of second point of connection with you, that offsetting presence of your physical face-to-face personality that students may not be getting in your course. So again, be careful about how you phrase things. So the last thing from me, and then I'm going to hand it over to Kristin for a few other things, is talking about facilitating discussions and forums. And this is going to be a bigger subject for me here. Discussions and forums are a part of most, not absolutely all, but most of your courses, I should expect. They're certainly a part of virtually all online courses at the University of Waterloo, and remote courses will be a little different in general. So you're probably going to be dealing with facilitating some level of discussion or forum in your course. So how do we do that? The first thing I want to emphasize about going into facilitating discussions is to get a sense of the purpose of the discussion. You might need to talk to your instructor about this, but why is this happening? Why are we having a conversation? Hopefully there's a good answer to that. Sometimes it's as simple as getting to know each other, having a social chat, or introducing each other, ourselves, or icebreakers at the start of a course. And sometimes it can be as deep and engaged as a full-blown graduate level seminar happening in discussion forums online, and a lot of space in between. Maybe questions, and maybe group work is happening in discussion forums. But get a sense of why. What is the point of this discussion forum? Keeping in mind that a forum itself is just a digital tool. It's just a place where we post messages. And a forum activity, what we do with it, is the real heart, the real point. So get a sense of what that activity is and why. Get a very clear sense of your instructor's expectations for the forum. What are they hoping students will accomplish by talking to each other through a forum activity? Get that really, really clear in your head. And then share it. Share it with the students. Fostering engagement in a forum, the research again is really quite clear. The number one most important thing is for students to know what you're expecting, what they're supposed to do in discussion forums. If they're not participating very much, if they're not engaging very well, it is usually because they were not on the same page as the instructor or the TA about what was expected. They thought they were doing a good job, but they weren't meeting that standard, weren't meeting that bar. So communicate very, very clearly and as explicitly as you possibly can with the students what's expected. At an absolute minimum, students should have a crystal clear picture of the following issues: how long their posts should be, or if you're using some other medium like a video back and forth discussion, how long the videos should be in that kind of situation, how often they should be checking in. Should they be in the forums 2 times a week, 3, 4? What should it be? How many times they should respond to their colleagues? How many response posts are you expecting in a conversation? Sometimes we use forums just to share work with each other, and maybe there's no response needed. Sometimes we're expecting a seminar discussion where students should be responding a lot. Make sure they know what you expect. And give them a really clear sense, as much as you can, of the characteristics of high quality posts and high quality engagement. What does that look like? Give some examples. Maybe create a sample post of your own, an initial post and a response that can give them a picture. This goes back again to the expectations for your forum. So for me, teaching graduate students, for example, I'll often say high quality posts need to have a certain amount of evidence drawn from what we're reading together. They need to make an argumentative point, and they need to be open to further conversation. That's a really, really high level. Maybe your forum activity is much simpler, but whatever it is, make sure they know what quality looks like. And above all, always super important for students, how exactly are they going to be marked? Needs to be crystal clear to them. So one way of doing this, wrapping that all together and kind of getting all those boxes checked at once, is to try to use discussion forum rubrics for grading discussions. I put yes for real there, because many of you maybe have an instinctive hatred of rubrics, or maybe I'm just projecting. I have an instinctive hatred of rubrics. But it's remarkable how useful these things can be. If your instructor already has a discussion rubric ready for you, that's fantastic. If they don't, maybe approach them and see if you can add one for yourself, or maybe for your whole group, can work on it together. If they say no, absolutely not, well, you might be a little bit stuck. But if there's any way of getting a rubric added in there, it can be really, really beneficial. And a good rubric will address each of these points so that you know and the students know exactly what's expected and how it's all going to affect their mark. One really nice thing about rubrics is they take a little bit of extra effort on the front end, but research shows, and I could confirm with my own experience too, it actually makes grading forms much, much quicker in the long run, especially if you have a big class involved. And it's also much more consistent. So see if you can use a rubric to get all of those issues checked off. So that's making crystal clear what students need to know about their discussion forums. And if you do that, you're going to see a huge improvement in quality of forums. So highly recommend that. Just a few other rules of thumb before I close here and hand it back over to Kristin. Just keep in mind, this discussions are primarily a student space. You don't want to dominate, you don't want to take over, you don't want everything to be back and forth between you and the student in most cases. But you do want to signal your presence. And that's a bit of a balancing act. It's something you have to make your own decisions about to a certain degree. one of the things I often like to do in my own forums is sometimes I won't post anything at all for a whole week, especially if the conversation's going really well and things are going nicely. But then I might make a comment and an announcement at the end of the week, thanking everybody for their participation and saying something that signals really clearly that, you know, I read the post. I know what happened in the conversation. I was there. I was part of this, but I was giving some distance so that I didn't dominate, so that it would be your space. Or posting judiciously. It's not that you can never ever post in the forums. However that works out, make sure your presence is clear, but don't take over in general. Model academic integrity and etiquette. This almost goes without saying, but it's worth bringing up in the online environment. Make sure that the way you communicate meets the standard that you're expecting from them. Model constructive and supportive critique. This can be tricky in the online space. You know, how you critique or criticize or disagree with something a colleague is saying in a productive way. It's harder. We're people who aren't used to learning online might be still getting used to the sort of expectations there. So model that for them. And if things are going slow, you might think about Socratic questions. Bring this up because we'll share a resource about this for you near the end. But making sure that you're asking questions and modeling the way of opening conversation up to move it forward. It's something people are getting used to online. And so think about some of the Socratic models you might use to accomplish that. So I'm now going to hand it back over to Kristin, who's going to talk about office hours, tutorials, and labs. And let me just stop my share here and mute. Thank you all. I will see you in the Q&A a little later.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm just gonna get my screen sharing again. Sorry. Let's take a moment. Okay. Oops, I didn't advance it. Starting at the wrong spot here. Sorry about that. Let's click through. Okay. I'll just address one question while I'm clicking through. There's a question, does CEL have sample online discussion rubrics? At the end, we'll send out an email with some resources, and we can include some discussion, a link to some example discussion rubrics that you could use. Okay, a lot of animations here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so
you're in presenter mode, by the way, Kristin. You want to switch to? We're seeing your notes and stuff.
Oops. Okay. Just a second here. Okay. Sorry, just a moment here. Okay. Can you see now? Can you see the slides now?
Yep, looks good.
Great. Okay. So for many of you, you've got some questions about office hours, tutorials, and labs. So it's a big thing of what you do when you're TAing in an in-person class, a course, and you're wondering how do you do that online. Excuse me. There's two ways we are gonna break this down. I'll break it down and present some options that might be available to you. So there's, just in terms of differentiating the nomenclature here, we have structured labs and tutorials in some disciplines, and that is in contrast to the student help or support sessions. So structured labs and tutorials tend to have learning outcomes associated with them. There might be a lab requirement as the students are showing up. They have something to do within the lab. Then there's maybe an assessment activity associated with that that may or may not be graded. and student support sessions. Those would be like your tutorials or office hours that are less structured. There isn't a learning outcome necessarily associated with it. It's not graded. It's completely optional, and they're much more student-oriented or student-led. So students would typically, maybe you hold a 1 hour office hour once a week, and you wait for students to show up, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So we're going to talk about those two different types of tutorials. And there are two different approaches that you can offer for both of these, and I'm going to walk you through some options that are both asynchronous. So that means you and the students are doing things at slightly different times, but there's no requirement for everyone to show up all at the exact same moment in time, versus synchronous, which is live. Everyone needs to be there at a given time. So I'll go through some options and talk about pros and cons of those two modalities, because they may or may not be, your instructor may have some requirements about whether you do a synchronous or asynchronous session, or it may be up to you, or it may be up for discussion. I just want to emphasize, for everything that we're suggesting today, from handling email to announcements, discussion boards, all of these tools, all of these need to be discussed with your instructor about the parameters or the expectations they have for your interactions, and you should be checking with them before you just, go in and start posting announcements. Make sure that that is an expectation or a rule that they would like you to take on. So if you're doing running an asynchronous lab or tutorial, you would start by posting the required instructional materials that you might normally present in a lab. So that might be reading materials, or it might be a video. That might be a video that you're creating yourself. If that makes you feel anxious, there are other options. So don't just jump right into necessarily creating a video from scratch. There may be resources already available online that serve this purpose. So you don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. Again, talk to your instructor about what they would like you to cover. But there are videos out there. Maybe a Khan Academy video would serve the purpose, or you could work that in. Your textbook might have great online resources that can help to help as resources, instructional resources leading up to a tutorial. If you are going to create your own video instructional materials, you might choose to do a narrated PowerPoint or create a video demonstration. We'll send out a link to some resources on some best practices of how to do that. There's a Waterloo website called Keep Learning, and there are lots of resources on there to help sort of guide you through how to do that. An important rule of thumb, if you are creating video resources, is to keep them short and sweet. Don't repeat what is already available to students. So don't repeat video lectures, just refer them back if the instructor has already created a video lecture. Don't repeat the textbook, just tell them where to go to find those pages that are going to be most relevant. Really, if you're going to create something, it should be unique, something they can't find somewhere else already in the course. And you want to keep those videos short and small in size, under 500 megabytes, because of uploading and downloading issues. If you do need to create a little mini presentation that's a little bit longer, maybe consider breaking it into segmented chunks, so breaking up by section or topic, so that the videos are a little smaller and easier for students to download that have technology restrictions. So students would typically engage in your instructional materials, and then they would do an activity, and they can do that individually or in groups. They can be broken into groups. Asynchronous is not completely without time. Typically they happen within a window, a frame of time, where both you and the students are engaged in an activity. So that might happen over the course of a week. And there's some back and forth, and there's some interaction that is still happening. It's just instead of happening on the same moment, it's extended over time. Importantly, if you're hosting these sessions, you want to make sure that if you are the one creating the activity, that activity is aligned with the learning outcomes that you've discussed with the course instructor, and that is very clear to students how they are going to be evaluated or what is expected of their participation? What do you need to see from them if it's going to be graded? If you're used to breaking your students into groups in your labs and tutorials, you can do that in Learn. If the activity that they're doing is a discussion forum, students can be broken into groups, smaller groups there. Depending on the activity or the question, that can be more fruitful, especially if you have a really large class. If students are working through problem sets or some kind of written activity or assignment, they can use collaborative documents is a good way to do that. If they are going to be using a collaborative document, have them add you. Because an important part of these labs is the ways in which you interact with students and you give them feedback and you provide support with them. So you're going to be monitoring what they're doing over the course of the week and checking in and providing feedback, answering their questions. That's an important part of it. So advantages to the asynchronous method is the flexibility that it provides. Students can work again at their own pace. There are fewer technical issues because that synchronous time component is not in there. So if their internet is down at a given moment, that's okay. They can do it a few minutes later or an hour or two later. Disadvantages are that they can feel more distant. You can feel that distance sometimes more in those asynchronous sessions because of that temporal lag. And some tasks may be more difficult or feel less authentic when done asynchronously. There just might not be a good asynchronous, a great asynchronous alternative, in which case you may choose to, or your instructor might require you to host a synchronous session. So in a synchronous session, all the students are present, or as many as possible. They'll try to be present. You'll present to the students, and then there typically is an activity that you will do similar to the asynchronous mode. It's just everyone's doing it all at the same time. If you're hosting a synchronous session, it is especially clear that you provide a clear outline to students what will be presented to them and what you will ask of them. There can be a lot of anxiety for students going into a synchronous session for the same reason you might have anxiety going into a synchronous session. It's live and you don't know what's going to happen. So the more you can prepare students for the unexpected or remove some of those unexpected elements, they'll have less anxiety going into it, and more of them will show up for it and be prepared to participate. So the tools, Daniel just briefly already mentioned the tool available in Learn, Virtual Classroom, or Bongo. WebEx is also available as a tool for hosting these virtual video synchronous sessions. Within these tools, you can break your students out into groups, into breakout groups, if you have work that you'd like students to be doing after you've presented some introductory information. So during those sessions, you can, as the facilitator, can pop into each of those groups to check in on students as they're working, see how it's going, provide feedback, answer their questions. So then that's really important to do if you're doing those sessions. Importantly, if you're doing synchronous sessions, actually, oh, just a second, not advancing. You'll need to have probably an alternative, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. So the advantages to synchronous sessions are that they might be easier for you to design because they feel more familiar. You're used to working synchronously if you're used to teaching labs and tutorials. You may feel more connected. Your students may feel more connected because of that immediate presence. And some tasks are just easier or more authentic when done synchronously. The disadvantages are significant to consider because of the restrictions around student availability, time zones. Students are if they're in China, it's 12 hours difference. That's hard to accommodate. There are going to be technology and internet connection issues for students. and accessibility issues. And all of these together will mean that for some students will be impossible for them to attend a synchronous session. For some students, they will be less likely to participate in a synchronous session than an asynchronous session because of some of that pressure or anxiety that comes along with doing something in a live forum. So it's important to provide, for these reasons, important to provide an alternative if these sessions are required for students or there's any kind of assessment or grade associated with them. So some alternatives are, it's important to record these sessions to make them available to students that cannot or will not be able to make it. It's important to let students know that if you are recording, that they are being recorded. And again, this might impact their participation a bit. Some students might not be terribly comfortable with it, or it might change how open or responsive they are to questions. Something to keep in mind is if you're doing the breakout groups in WebEx or virtual classrooms, those breakout rooms are not recorded. So anything that sort of happens in there will, the students that are not present are not going to be able to see or partake in that. If you are recording, make sure you stop the recording during that time and then start it again when everyone comes back to the group, if there's another piece to that. If the subject matter of your labs or tutorials often involve students sharing things that there's the critical component of that you feel would really be hindered by a recording, you don't have to necessarily record that session, or maybe a part of the session, maybe the summary that comes after when students come back from their groups. You don't have to record that. You could provide an alternative format, a written summary of essentially what transpired through the discussion that followed. And where no students are being called out by name and it's more anonymous, students might feel a little safer sharing more openly if the recording is not there. But importantly, you have to provide some kind of alternative for those students that can't make it. And of course, you'll need to provide, if there are required learning outcomes and assessments, that you'll have to provide some kind of alternative there. So either the same activities, just students are doing it on their own and submitting it to Dropbox. If your tutorial is much more discussion-based, providing that recording, an alternative assessment would be for students to maybe write a reflection and contribute their own questions or considerations, and then they could submit that for participation grade. Just some ideas. And then of course there's a hybrid version where parts can be synchronous and not synchronous. So if you're designing a lab or tutorial, maybe you just really think about what components of that have to be synchronous, because the whole thing might not need to be synchronous. So that provides a little more flexibility. So an option is that, initially the materials are presented to students ahead of time, and they're really just getting together in that a shorter synchronous session for the activity component of it, or vice versa. The information and the sharing and the synchronous part happens first, and then students have some time to go off asynchronously and work on their own or together in groups on the activity or the assessment. And during that time, you're available providing feedback to them. And so finally, so the student help and support sessions. So these are a little different. There's a couple options here, and one works really well and one doesn't work quite so well. So what you might be used to are unstructured what we call unstructured student-led help sessions. And those would typically be your office hours. You have an hour a week where you're in your office and students can come by. It's student-led because typically they're coming with their own questions, right? You're not necessarily preparing ahead of time. They're optional. Students might come, they might not come. What we find online is that how this would take place is you would say you're going to be online for an hour, you turn your video on and you wait for students to show up. Probably 95 to 99% of the time, students don't show up at all. This is not a good use of your time. They feel it's unstructured, so they don't know what to expect. Are you going to ask something of them? Who's going to be there? Do they need to know something? They feel vulnerable. They don't want to share their problems or the things that they're struggling with. They don't want to be put on the spot. They're very uncomfortable with this method. So we usually recommend against it, just because there's not good uptake on it, and there are other alternatives that are more effective. Another alternative is a structured, student-fed, TA-led session. So in these sessions, basically what you do is the first part of it is structured. You present on some concepts that students are struggling with, or aspects of assessments that students haven't done very well on, and they could use some extra help with as a group. And how you get that information is 3 ways primarily. You can ask the instructor if they've taught the course before and they know there are bottleneck concepts or concepts that students are really challenged by, and then you can structure a tutorial based on that. You can poll students with the instructor's permission, or send out surveys to find out what students are struggling with. That could be done on a weekly basis, a bi-weekly basis, or most valuably right before assessments. And you can review previous assessments and create a summary of like where students were struggling, and then provide some extra help. If you want students to show up, don't keep it a secret what you're going to cover. Just tell them what you're going to go through, so that the students that are struggling know that this is going to be important for them to show up for, and the students that are not. Record the session, make it available later on. And you can have an additional open Q&A at the end for students that do want to ask further questions. They can. There's usually pretty good uptake on something like this. One-on-one appointments, they're really just on a case-by-case basis. What if students are emailing you with questions that anything that's course related, really should go to a discussion forum where all students can see those questions, and that's part of really managing your workload, your email load. This is really important. So try to send students back to that discussion board, anything course related, assessments, assignments, everything that's not of a personal nature. And then it's up to you to coordinate with students if they really want a one-on-one. If you have a small, and I actually saw a question about this in the Q&A, I'll address it now. If you have a small class, and you've discussed this with your instructor, you can have regular check-ins with your students. You can schedule those ahead of time. And that can be really any modality that you and your students are comfortable with. It can be on a case-by-case. We have some TAs that talk to their students on the phone. They have a weekly meeting with their students on the phone to check in. They have email correspondence or a Skype session or something like that. For sure, you can check in with them if you have time to do that. Just make sure that they know that that's what you're going to do. So that might be something that you let them know about at the beginning of the course in an opening announcement, that you're going to set these times up with students, and here's why we're doing it, and here's why it might be useful. So yeah, that's an option. It really just depends on how many students you have and what's realistic and what's useful.
I was going to say on that point, in terms of the question, which you're breaking up now, it's far bigger of a worry that students will feel isolated than that they're going to feel like you're invading. So if there's one thing you're going to correct the isolation.
Yeah.
And obviously, if a student doesn't respond, you're not going to email them 10 times a day and get all in their face. But students vastly will appreciate it. So I would definitely go for it if you have that time.
Yeah. Another thing that actually can really help, and there's some research for this too, is when you're monitoring, you're noticing a student early in the term is handing things in late or hasn't handed in an assessment at all, reach out to them. It can make a difference between a student totally dropping off and just either failing the course or dropping it completely. Reaching out and saying like, hey, I noticed you handed that assignment in late, just checking in, is everything okay? it lets them know that somebody is watching. And until you've reached out to them or communicated with them, they don't know that they're not invisible to you, right? And most of your students aren't invisible. You see what they do, you see what they're handing in, you see their names, like they let them know that they're people and you can see them. So there are different ways that you reach out to them just to check in a low stakes kind of way. Hey, how you doing? Do you need some help with something? Offering some flexibility too if it's possible. If a student early on in the term has not handed something in, we've heard from students where they've completely changed their experience of the online course when an instructor reached out and said, hey, you didn't hand this in yesterday. Are you going to hand it in? Is everything okay? Do you need an extra day? And that can really make all the difference. So, okay, enough on that. Another option in terms of managing your time, so this is also related to a question, and we can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A period. But yeah, these courses are 24/7, and you might feel pressure to be on 24/7, or students might have that expectation if you do not tell them what to expect. So facilitator live windows are times where you have scheduled ahead of time and let students know, hey, I'm going to be online every week at this time in the discussion forum, looking at the discussion, like monitoring, facilitating, being present. That might be the QA discussion forum if there isn't an active assessed discussions or any other discussion in the course. You might be using the chat option in Learn, or you might just be on your email answering questions, personal questions, and in the discussion forum asking course-related questions. What we find is for some students, they will structure their learning around the times when they know a facilitator is going to be around to answer the questions as they come up. That can be hugely valuable to them and keep students also moving forward in a regular way, kind of keep them on track, right? So students don't fall behind. This can be really, really helpful and helpful for you in terms of scheduling your time. So when you're on maybe twice a week, you're on for an hour or two, depending on your time and how many TAs are in the course. And then when you're off, you're off. You're not on the discussion forum all of the time. Or you maybe you're just popping in every once in a while to make sure no one's swearing at each other. If you set the expectations, that usually doesn't happen. So just to close up, a summary, some time management strategies here, really. So planning ahead is important, not just for your students, but also for you, scheduling ahead of time. When you first get into the course, look at the course schedule. You can, ahead of time, if you're responsible, you discuss this with the instructor, you're responsible for announcements and reminders. In Learn, you can populate those ahead of time. You can write them all out. You can set a time and a date when you'd like them to be released, and you can have them be released 3 days before an assignment is due, a week before an assignment is due. Think about these things ahead of time, because once you get into the term, as the term goes along, just as it does for students, that workload starts to build up and demand builds up. So if you can get these things out of the way early on, you really look like you're on the ball to students and that you're keeping up. Schedule facilitator meetings. So if between you and the instructor, or you and the other TAs ahead of time around assessments, right? So to find out what the requirements are for the assessments, and if possible to maybe go through a couple assessments to align your grading. That's highly recommended. The term will get busy, so if you can schedule those ahead of time with the instructor, that's great. And figure out what those facilitator live times might be, coordinating those maybe with other TAs or with the instructor. You're going to want to use your time efficiently. Many birds, one stone. So some strategies for that would be really answering all those questions, course-related questions in a discussion forum. Just politely send students that have emailed you back to the discussion forum. Breaking up the Q&A discussion forum by week or by topic helps to organize those questions, so students can then go back and find answers to their questions related to a specific topic more easily. If you don't have time, time hasn't been allocated to provide students with formative feedback on any assessments that you're grading, you can save a lot of time, emails, by providing the students with a class level formative feedback summary. So identifying really the key patterns, the key areas of confusion or the mistakes that students made, so that they can make more sense of their grade. There'll be fewer emails about why did I get this email. And that can be really in an announcement, a typed out announcement. You might make a little short video. There's different ways that you can do that. And you can also have that kind of feedback feed into a structured student-fed, TA-led group tutorial. So that's pretty much what we've covered. We've touched on a lot of topics and things that I think many of these things could really be their very own webinar each. So we'll go to the Q&A now and start to work through some of your questions.
So jumping here, the very first question that got a lot of thumbs up has definitely been addressed in various ways. How do we establish guidelines for letting students know that we are there, but not always there? As someone who's finished out the semester online, what became evident was that students needed more support as expected, but students also expected us to be available much more than before, expecting faster responses, more office hours. How can we communicate kindly and respectfully that TAs are also human and have timelines, without making students hesitate to contact us? So I think just to kind of summarize a couple of things that Kristin was saying there, one is make sure set a schedule for yourself, make sure you communicate it very, very clearly to students right off the bat from the start. Live times can be great. If you're not going to use those, let them know how else you're going to organize yourself. If it's really clear from the beginning, that will take care of a lot of this. The next thing in my that I picked up from Kristin to just add to the summary is focus on general discussion boards if you can. If there are questions coming at you that other students might have, make sure you're signaling to students those questions should go in a forum, so you don't have to get 5 emails about the same topic. If it's specific and personal, then emailing you is appropriate and you'll deal with it. But if it's anything more general, should go in a place where everyone can see it. And then adding potentially lifetimes. And the last thing is to just, it's kind of captured in the question, communicate it kindly and respectfully. Just do exactly that. If a student's emailing you several times and seeming really impatient, and you're responding 20 hours later, well, within the window, you can just say, the normal things we'd say, being kind and respectful and indicating, this is my schedule and I'm sticking on it and all that kind of thing. And hopefully that will make a big difference for your students. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Kristin. It was just sort of a summary of what you said, honestly.
Yeah. If there are also times, so they recommend the 24-hour window. Obviously, in some cases, there are going to be exceptions to that. You're not going to be able to do that.
It's not always.
There are days for sure. Thursdays, I'm not going to be able to get to them for whatever reason. Just let them know. If weekends are out, you're just there's no way I'm answering emails on the weekend. Let them know.
If students have the information, the vast majority of the time, most of them will totally understand and it'll be fine too. What they really want to know is what they can expect from your response.
Yeah. And if you say you're going to do it, do it.
And do it.
You got to stick to it. So
That's
careful
right.
what you promise.
Stick to it in both directions too. Don't feel like you need to make if you're going to make a no, I'm not responding over the weekend, then that's the rule, and stick to it on that side as well, because like I said in the question, you're a person too, and treat yourself fairly, no question about it. But just communicate to students.
So
next one, you want to? Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Sure. So the next question is that it's about the number of TAs that have been assigned. How do we manage providing all the extra support that is needed in these unprecedented times and the 10 hours per week that we are supposed to be working? You can't do everything, is what it comes down to. So I think in terms of, it ties into the previous answer, letting students know what to expect, and planning ahead about how you're going to allocate your time. and have that meeting with the instructor about, okay, here are my 10 hours. Here are the tasks that you would like me to do. Here's how many hours each week I'll allocate to each of these pieces. You can break it down that way. Another thing that you can do is track your time on each task that you're doing. So if you're working on the course or you're in the course, pay attention to how much time you're in there, and you can keep a log of it. And that can be helpful for the instructor to be reporting back to them, like, hey, here's how much time I've been spending on this one task. Does that seem right to you? And in some cases, they'll say like, oh gosh, okay, yeah, you're gonna not have any hours left over for the final assignment. I really need you to do that. I'm gonna take over that for you. So just making sure that you're keeping track and that you're communicating with the instructor about where you're spending your time, and that that's aligned with their expectation for you. And that, yeah, scheduling it's kind of key.
Yeah, it's instructor communication, I think, it can be hard. I mean, I know sometimes, depending on your relationship with your instructor, that's not always the easiest thing necessarily. Hopefully for most of you, it's a very, very positive working relationship, and everything's great there. But at the end of the day, it comes down to aligning that with them, and they do end up having to pick up slack if you don't have hours left, and that's the bottom line. I mean, that's not necessarily great for them either, but that's how the system works. So again, be fair to yourself and be clear in communicating. If you do both of those things, it should go as well as it can.
For some of these instructors, it's their first time teaching online too. So they might not realize how long some of these things are taking. And that's where the tracking and the communication back to them is going to be important, because there's a learning curve for them too. We're all in this together.
Yeah.
So the next question that's popped to the top is, are there any tips for what to do if a certain student isn't participating or responding to any discussion posts?
Reaching out is the number one, and this sort of came up. There was a question about is it invasive to be checking it? If you have the time, absolutely do that. And if you're looking at some of the metrics on Learn or wherever else you're noticing for whatever reason that students aren't checking in, certainly if they're not completing assignments, you're going to notice that. But also if you notice that they're just not even logging into the course, that can be a really key telltale that something is going on. It makes a gigantic difference. Kristin already said this, but it's worth repeating. It makes an enormous difference for students just to get a friendly email saying, "How I noticed you haven't logged in. Can I help you with anything?" And not jumping to any conclusions about why, or just offering assistance. And a lot of students will take you up on it. And as Kristin said, it is in many cases the difference between a student ending up succeeding in a course, passing, doing well, and simply dropping out and either withdrawing or dropping out without withdrawing. Obviously, you don't have absolute control. There's going to be situations where people vanish and you don't hear anything from them. But if you reach out, it just changes the entire psychology for the student. Oh, there's a real person who's my TA, who's actually there. I mean, they're behind a computer screen, but they're really there, and you just enter a whole different modality of learning. So definitely keep an eye on it. Reach out with a friendly email, and maybe if a few days go by, a follow up. At a certain point, you can let things go, but reach out.
And it might not be that they're just ignoring and not participating. There might be a real issue at hand, and it gives you the opportunity to provide some help or guidance that can, make a difference. So reach out. Don't always assume that they don't care. They're dealing with a lot of stuff this term. The next question at the top here, is there a standard list of resources that we can or should provide to students for mental health supports? So Campus Wellness has lots of resources. We're going to send out an email at the end that has some resources. So we could include some in there. Yeah, I don't know, Daniel, do you have anything that
I was going to say? I mean, it's very unfortunately this is an issue that's much on the radar screen of CL, CTE, the rest of us who are involved in the transition and the pivot. It's extremely important. I'm really glad it's being brought up. The reason there's so much hesitation here is that right now we don't have as many resources as we should have with respect to this issue in terms of remote teaching. We're trying to catch up, so we can send what links are available. The number one thing I would emphasize is I'm glad you're even asking, and to have this on your radar screen as a TA is already a big step in the right direction. To be aware that this is going to be an issue for a lot of your students, always, no matter what, but especially, of course, during COVID, and to care and remember that they are people back there behind that screen somewhere really matters. So yeah, we'll send what resources we can. I wish we could send more. I wish there was more knowledge and theory about the best things to do about this. So we'll do what we can for you now, but really appreciate this question being asked.
Yeah. We have, there's resources for also like just things to look out for if you're monitoring like changes in student behavior, like just some signs to be aware of. So I can send that out, that can alert you to where situations where there might be a student mental health issue at play. But the biggest thing really is like this term more than any other term, your social presence is important. Paying attention to the students, especially those that are actually maybe dropping off or falling behind, reaching out to them.
So next one is, what do you recommend if your instructor is not open to creating more features dedicated to student help and or comfort? It's, of course, a very real possibility. Your instructor, for whatever reason, I mean, there are people too, may not have the ability to create specific features. In that situation, I would just focus the energy on the way you're communicating with students and all of those strategies for creating presence that we sort of identified that really don't require any new activity or new tool. It's the announcements, it's the way you're saying what you're saying and communicating and marking, doing all the things that you are going to be doing in the course for sure, with an eye to presence will make the biggest difference anyway. So if you're not getting movement from your instructor, take the spaces that you do have, and presence in those spaces will make a difference, a huge difference.
You can also identify for the instructor maybe what you feel comfortable doing or what you could offer. If you have an idea of how you'd like to support students through this stuff, coming up with the idea yourself and saying, hey, here's what I can do. And it might just be a matter of like saying, okay, well, if students haven't handed something in, or they've handed in something late, I'm going to reach out to them, reach out to those students. It might be as simple as that. Yeah. The next one, I need a second to read it.
Live sessions with math or drawings.
The tablet already. So if you're doing a virtual session, the virtual classroom has a whiteboard option on it that you can draw on using a mouse, right, Daniel?
Yes, that's right. It does have a whiteboard.
So there are tools. There's a tool, Write and Learn, that you can use for that, for a synchronous session or a session. You can do a session and record it, and then post that online for students to view asynchronously afterwards.
You definitely can ask students to give you questions in advance. That's a great idea. It will help the session to be more efficient and quicker. I would go for that for sure. Another thing you can look at, and you might know more about this tool than I do, Kristin, but Piazza is designed for asynchronous discussions surrounding STEM issues and math especially. So I think
math uses Piazza a lot.
The tool Piazza, which is an asynchronous discussion forum basically tool, but designed for math, precisely because of this issue, the need for things like equations and that sort of thing. So you can look at it. I wouldn't be able to comment on an absolutely specific situation, which of these tools would be best, but those would be the options to look at. The whiteboard and Synchronous with the questions in advance, absolutely, and then maybe Piazza can help you, or maybe posting a video.
Yeah, you can create a section in Piazza that's like, you would be like tutorial 1, and then it just gives students a time frame in which they need to provide you with the questions that they have. And then you let them know that that's what you're going to cover, and you're going to work through those problems or problem sets right in the tutorial. Yeah.
Questions for getting student feedback on what they liked or didn't during Learn sessions.
You can use polls or surveys right in Learn. If you're comfortable using Qualtrics, you can create a Qualtrics survey, and you can post a link to the Qualtrics survey in the announcements. Those are good ways to get feedback from students. If you are okay with email, like it's kind of a lo-fi, low-tech way of doing it, is you can ask students at the end of the session, any feedback, ask for any feedback, and they can email it to you. But if the class is really large and there are a lot of students attending or watching those sessions, using a survey is going to be a bit easier probably for you to digest and keep email manageable. But asking students for feedback is actually one of those social presence things. It's one of those things that provides students with a deeper sense of participation, and like you care about what they think, you care about whether they felt it went well. And if you can take that feedback and do something with it, right? You can incorporate it and say, last time you said this time I'm going to do that. That means a lot to them, and it gives them a sense of control over their learning. It's really important. So yeah, it's a great idea.
So the next one is, does the university have any guidelines for which virtual learning platforms we should be using, or can we use any technology program according to our preferences? The ones that we're mainly supporting in terms of, I guess I'm reading this as indicating synchronous tools. So we're using, although I'm not actually completely sure what this, yeah, I mean, there are guidelines. Can we include that in our email in terms of the stuff that's past privacy and security and that kind of thing, Kristin? Do you think?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing is that there are tools that have been through privacy and security, and that's a big consideration for the university in terms of tool usage. So you've probably heard about the Zoom bombing, right? Their practices. It's not that you can't use Zoom, we're using it, but there are some practices that you should have in place to protect yourself and students from people kind of hacking in and stealing the show. But there are other issues with other tools in terms of privacy and security, and students' privacy and privacy to their computer, and whether websites or tools are really secure. If there were an issue where a student used a tool that you recommended and that opened them up to malware or being hacked, then there are some liability issues. So we recommend that you really stick to the tools and resources that have really been checked by Waterloo. So we'll include a link to that so you can see what's available.
We have a couple more minutes here. Do you have any thoughts on whether or not to record the structured student-fed TA-led support sessions? Yeah, if you possibly can, yes. Yep,
definitely. Record those because you've got the questions ahead of time. It's structured, it's a video. And you can choose to say at the end, hey, we're going to turn the video off if you have any other questions. If you want students to really, participate more, and then you could add a written summary of the other questions and answers that came up. Okay.
There's a suggestion here. Thank you from Dr. Kristin Logel at Renison. I'll be very interested to take a look at that. Do we have a minute or two more for one or two more? Okay, Sarah, yeah. What technology expectations are there for us as TAs? That's a really good question. I don't think there's a crystal clear answer to, honestly. I guess all I would say off the bat is if you're experiencing issues of technological access problems, naturally the first thing to do is talk to the instructor about it. You know, you're also under COVID, so maybe you're out somewhere rural and it's not easy for you to get online. We were talking about that with respect to students, but of course it would affect you, potentially could affect you as well. If there's those issues, get in touch with the instructor, the rest of the TA team, you know, see where you can participate. Maybe your role needs to even be shifted a little bit. But I'm not aware of anything absolutely clear saying to be a TA you need to have, you know, X, Y, and Z.
No, and it'll affect mostly those synchronous sessions. That'll be the thing that'll be impacted the most.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have technology restrictions, make sure that you raise that with the instructor in that first initial meeting that you have with them, so that you can you can plan for that. As long as do we interpret that question correctly? I'm wondering technology expectations, or is the question about knowing technologies, like how to use tools and whatnot? If the question's about how to knowing tools, I just wanted to mention that there are some webinars available, like if you're using, that are coming up on the Keep Learning website, the webinars section, on the use of PebblePad. That's the e-portfolio tool that's used here at Waterloo, and as well as Learn. If you're new to Learn, there are a couple sessions coming up on Introduction to Learn and Tools. Those are the main technologies that you're going to be responsible really for knowing, are those tools that are within Learn. If an instructor has chosen to use a different technology, then you'll need to learn that, but they may have chosen that technology because they know it well, and there'll be somebody that you can go to for support for that tool. How are we doing for time? We have 2 minutes. Sarah, do you have any, can we answer another question, or, yep.
Yeah. I wanted to jump down to the guidelines for reaching out. Some research that students may feel judged if we reach out, assuming that they're struggling. There's not a script to give you, but I absolutely resonate with it. You don't want to be assuming that they're struggling. You don't come in and say, well, you haven't logged in, so you're struggling or something like that. Just make sure what you're trying to signal is just the open door. That's what you're trying to signal. Not that you think they're doing badly or that anything is going wrong.
You just
noticed, yeah.
You just noticed the behavior.
And can I help?
Don't interpret the behavior for them. Just like the thing that they didn't do. They didn't hand in the assignment. They didn't respond to the discussion board. They haven't accessed the course. And you're just saying like, hey, I noticed you didn't do that. How's it going? Is there anything I can help with? And then let them share with you what they want, right? You do not want to put them on the spot. Identify the behavior, don't interpret it. There's another quick question we can answer about accessibility. Do all YouTube videos have transcripts? Are these generally reliable? No, the answer is no. So if the question is about linking to YouTube, a resource that is on YouTube, there's a couple considerations there. One, you don't want to link to a YouTube resource where the poster doesn't have the license, copyright license, not their material to be sharing. So that's one thing to pay attention to. The other thing is that not all videos have a transcript enabled. And legally, we're not allowed, none of us are allowed to create a transcript for something that we do not have the copyright for. So you would have to email the poster to say, hey, can I make a transcript for this? Or can you turn transcription on? So that is an important consideration if you are linking to resources online, videos online, especially YouTube online, that they might not be accessible, and you might not be able legally to make them accessible transcripts. So yeah, some of them do. Another thing with YouTube too is it doesn't work in China. So those videos also might not be accessible for that reason. There are restrictions in some countries in terms of what students are going to be able to access. How are we? Okay, I think we're at time. Yeah.
So there's a few more good questions here. I don't know if what we want to do with them, but out of time now.
Yeah, we are at 11:30, so I do want to respect people's time if people need to be logging off now. But what I will suggest is I can work with Kristin and Daniel and see if we can even just get some bullet point responses to maybe some of these questions. And have those responses sent out to you in the email. You will get slides after this, as well as that resource listing. And I do see even there are some great suggestions about those mental health resources in the Q&A. So we'll make sure that some of those resources are sent out in the email that you will get following this session. So first of all, a huge thank you to Daniel and Kristin for putting this together. I know over at CEL, you're very busy as so many people are transitioning to remote classes. So we really, really appreciate you taking the time to put this presentation together and delivering this information to our grad students who are TAing this coming term. And for you who are TAing, I hope that this was helpful and makes you feel more confident as you step into the coming term. I will point out that when you exit the webinar today, you will have an option to click on a link to a survey just to provide us your feedback about this session. So I'd ask you to please do that if you have a chance. It just lets us know what we can improve for future events as they happen, and as we continue to do more online and virtual events too. That's really helpful for us. So thank you again for joining us, and like I said, stay tuned for that email. And just one other comment for those of you who are trying to take this workshop for credit through CTE. CTE will be receiving an attendance list. Zoom tracks your attendance, so we'll send that on to them so that they can track your workshop attendance. So please follow up with CTE afterwards if you do have questions or concerns about that. All right, so thank you all for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.